Okay. Show me.
Hi there guys, welcome back to the GepRC channel. Thank you very much for tuning in. And this here is the GepRC Phantom HD. So this is a 2.5 inch freestyle quadcopter with a DJI, well, Caddx Nebula digital setup. Very nice quadcopter in my humble opinion, and in this video I've already done one video on this quadcopter and I'll link to that up there. In that video I only flew it on 3S, and a lot of people told me well, this quadcopter doesn't really fly on 4S. It has flyaways and it doesn't work well on 4S. I flew it on 4S and guess what? I had flyaways on 4S. Also, I busted up one of the motors. Happens, right? We break things in FPV land. But well, therefore this video took a little longer. But in this video I am going to show you how I flew this quadcopter on 4S. I'm going to show you what I changed on the quadcopter to have it fly on 4S. And let me see. Yeah, I'll tell you if the quadcopter actually needs 4S. I already told you that it flies well on 3S, so 4S is that needed for this 2.5 inch Phantom. And I'll give you my closing thoughts on this GepRC Phantom HD. Is this the quadcopter you need? So let's actually start with one of the flights I did with this quadcopter on 4S. So I should note that the weather wasn't great. It's fall in the Netherlands, right? The weather was, well, it had been raining in the morning and the weather was abysmal. But I shouldn't make excuses for the camera. This is the Caddx Nebula and it has a great reputation. Not so much. So yeah, the range is great, right? It's better than analog. And you can see where you're going, but it doesn't look great. It looks misty, but it wasn't misty. At least, was it misty? No, it wasn't misty at all. It wasn't sunny, but it should definitely look better than it does. Okay, so the quadcopter itself, this is on 4S. Regrettably, you don't get an OSD in your recordings, but this is on 4S, and you can see that the quadcopter actually flies. Again, in a second I'll show you the Betaflight configuration that makes it fly. And is this perfect? You can now and again see a little bit of propellers oscillation, but you can also, hopefully, see that I can power through the propellers oscillation. Barely. This is not a super powerful quadcopter, right? It's a lightweight quadcopter, but still it's pretty good, and I could easily, if I'd want to, fly around the propellers oscillations you see in this flight. Any quadcopter can be made to show propellers oscillation, in case you wonder. If you fly your quadcopter badly, you'll have propellers oscillation. And again, this is more than good enough, the tune you see here, more than good enough to fly this quadcopter smoothly. More importantly, however, it actually flies well and you don't get flyaways. Quite important in the quadcopter. Yeah, and again, regrettably, that's a bit of an omission by GepRC. Not the only omission of this quadcopter, we'll get to that in my closing thoughts on it, but not adding a 4S tune or a 4S setup to the quadcopter. They do advertise it as a 4S capable quadcopter, right? But there's no tune, no setup, and if you try to fly the quadcopter on 4S as is, right out of the box, you will have flyaways. And is that true? Yeah, basically on any 4S battery you will have flyaways on this quadcopter if you don't change the tune or the setup. So yeah, what shall I say? To me this is fine, by the way, the FPV feed. I don't care too much about the FPV feed looking great. The only thing I care about in the FPV feed is if I can see where I'm going. And yes, the latency of this Nebula camera is a bit longer, worse. Not as good as the DJI camera. I can definitely sense that. This is a freestyle quadcopter, so it's not a huge problem, but I can definitely sense it, and I would definitely rather not see that latency. So guys, the GepRC Phantom HD on 4S Who knew it works? And I flew the quadcopter on these Lipos. These are CNHL 450 mAh 4S Lipos. With these Lipos I got me flight times of approximately 4 to 5 minutes. In general, after 5 minutes I'd actually be on storage voltage still, so I could probably fly them, well, 6 to 7 minutes. Which is nice, and that's not just flying around, but well, actually doing freestyle maneuvers. So these are definitely not the only Lipos that would work on this quadcopter, obviously, but these are the ones I used in case you're wondering, and I'll link to those in the description down below. Then the GepRC Phantom on 4S. How did I get it to fly well on 4S? I wish I could tell you that I got the quadcopter flying well on the stock Betaflight firmware, but I didn't. I upgraded the firmware and that helped a lot, regrettably. It would have been much easier to tell you, you can simply change the tune a bit on the stock Betaflight configuration and that'll solve the 4S problems, the flyaways. But it didn't. So I upgraded the quadcopter to Betaflight 4.2.3. And after that I didn't have to change a whole lot actually. As you can tell here, I moved the master multiplier down to 0.9 and I increased the feed forward transition. That last part, I'm not completely sure if it's really needed, but it did make the quadcopter fly better. So feed forward transition 0.4, and let me see, yeah, only a little change, right? Master multiplier 0.9. Then in my rates I did add expo, that'll definitely help the quadcopter out, but that's mostly a personal thing, right? And then the filtering, this is the filtering I used. And I actually think that these values, the 1.4 for both of these filtering sliders, is the same as in the stock setup. But I think that it works out differently in this new Betaflight version. Correct me if I'm wrong. Suffice to say, however, that my quadcopter flies well on these values, and you should definitely not have flyaways if you follow these settings. If you use these settings, your Phantom HD shouldn't have flyaways on 4S. So, does this GepRC Phantom 2.5 inch quadcopter actually need 4S? It flies very well right out of the box on 3S. So, again, does it need 4S? I think it's very nice to have the option. Basically, you get two quadcopters in one like that. And the real difference between flying it on 3S and on 4S is, well, it's speed, but mostly where you would want to fly the quadcopter. If you fly this quadcopter on a small field, a park, this quadcopter will fly better on 3S. It might actually be too fast for that spot, right? It's easier to control. And the flip side of that is, if you try this quadcopter on a bigger field, like the one I just showed you in my flying clip, in the test flight, on a field like that, you'd want to fly the quadcopter on 4S, otherwise it would feel sluggish. Right? It's far more exciting to fly the quadcopter on a bigger field on 4S. On 4S, it's actually a pretty fast quadcopter. Also, it seemed to be a little more quiet somehow on 4S. But that might have just been my imagination. Actually, that's one of the benefits of this quadcopter, or the pros of the quadcopter. It's pretty quiet on both 3S and 4S, which is very nice, of course. You wouldn't annoy people tremendously with this quadcopter. So, being able to fly the quadcopter on 4S definitely expands its range of fun, I'd say. You get more out of your quadcopter being also able to fly it on 4S. So in mine I set up two profiles, one 3S profile and one 4S profile, and well, that way I can fly it either way. Let's wrap this up. You already noticed that I'm pretty positive about this quadcopter. It flies great. I had me a lot of fun with this quadcopter, and I think, in my humble opinion, it's the best freestyle quadcopter in this size. Not in the least because it's a top mounted setup, right? Most 2.5 inch and below quadcopters have a bottom slung battery setup. Regrettably, that nebula camera is moi, I know, but you do get the range of the DJI setup and you can see where you're going. Again, I don't really mind the camera being not top notch. While flying, I don't really notice too much really. Just as long as I can see where I'm going, and since this is not a racing quadcopter, yeah, the latency, I don't like it, definitely don't like it, but for now this is the best in this size in the digital landscape. Until further notice, right? I'm sure we'll see new versions of this Nebula camera, version 3, they'll perform better. For now, I'm okay with it, but it's not great. Then the quadcopter itself works out well, I think. It obviously should have come with a 4S setup, but maybe I'm nitpicking. It can at least fly on 3S and 4S. The frame, I've had me one major crash with this quadcopter. That was actually caused by one of the motors crapping out. The motor didn't crap out because of that crash. It was the other way around. Yeah, I'm not sure. That happens, right? Maybe I had me some sand in the motor. Could have been. I don't know. That motor crapped out. I had to replace it, and it's been fine ever since. Also, however, you might have noticed that my Nebula air unit, this thing over here, is suspended by zip ties, where it originally was suspended by plastic screws, and 3 of those 4 screws snapped in that crash. It was a pretty bad crash, definitely. But yeah, so again, this air unit thing is suspended by plastic screws, and that's not really good enough. You crash your quadcopters, right? Again, it was a particularly hard crash, but still, I think it should have held up. So that might be something GepRC should look into. Maybe replacing 2 of the 4 screws with metal, aluminium screws. That's not for me to solve, but again, the plastic screws that held this air unit onto the top plate, they weren't up to the job. And that is basically my only complaint about this quadcopter. I, again, very much enjoyed flying it. I have, as you know, the Crossfire version, but there's a version without receiver and one with an FR Sky receiver. So yeah, this obviously worked out well with the DJI digital setup. And it has a capacitor. It does not have a buzzer. Did the analog version have a buzzer? I'm not completely sure. I'm not completely sure. Yeah, so the propellers work out well. You've got a lot of grip with these 3-bladed propellers. The analog version originally came with 2-bladed propellers, which I didn't like too much. These are definitely better. And yeah, the 1404 motors work out well on the setup. Again, I don't really have complaints about it. So that's obviously nice. I'd say this is a recommended quadcopter. After some tuning for 4S, you've got yourself a great little 2.5-inch freestyle quadcopter, which is pretty silent, and it's obviously below 250 grams. And that's it. That's my take on the Phantom HD from GepRC. If you are left with questions, hit me up a comment down below. I want to thank you for watching. Catch you on the next video. Bye.